Hello friends, good afternoon to everyone. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Egor Yakovlev. Hello Egor.
Hello, Katya.
And I have a few questions, some from me and some from our viewers as well. First of all, congratulations on receiving the award. Could you please tell us what it was for, how it happened and why? How did you react when you received the award?
Well, let me clarify that this is the Z90 award. It's not a quarterly bonus. It's the Z90 award, an educational award that I received in the category of Best Book of the Year. The book is called The Nazi Genocide of the Peoples of the USSR, Unknown Pages. And, well, it's always nice to receive some recognition. It's always nice to know that you're not just writing for the drawer. And I assume that the book received the award because people actually read it. They read it, and obviously the jury members found something in it that resonated with their emotions, moods, and perceptions. The book deals with an extremely important topic because it, well, I would say, strengthens the foundations of historical memory about the tragedy our people experienced during the years of the Great Patriotic War. That is, we know quite a lot about the heroism of the Red Army soldiers and the entire Soviet people. But the famous and great song by David Tukmanov, Victory Day, captures a unique sentiment regarding the holiday of May 9th. It is a holiday with tears in our eyes. A holiday because it is a victory, but still with tears in our eyes. Because during the Great Patriotic War, our people suffered enormous losses. These were not only casualties on the battlefield, but also victims of the Nazi genocide, which was carried out in the first stage. After that, it was stopped, thank God. But unfortunately, it was still carried out in the first stage. And this is something we must also remember. I'm simply happy that I'm able in some way to influence this historical memory.
And what do you think, does your receiving the Best Educational Book Award for your work reflect a change, perhaps in the political situation, or in our country's perspective on history and the history of the Great Patriotic War?
Of course, it does reflect that. When I started working on this, it was still the early 2010s. Yes, 2011, 2012. And even then, when I recorded my first videos on this topic, which got about 1 million views, thanks to Dmitry Yuryevich Puchkov, this subject was not in the focus of the government's attention. And you could even say it was somewhat marginal. That is, the very assertion that the Russian, Ukrainian, or Belarusian people were subjected to genocide was, for the most part, regarded by the strictly scientific academic establishment as marginal and unnecessary. There was no particular interest in this, although...
But why is this necessary after all?
Well, it's necessary for several reasons. First of all, because it is historical truth. That's one. Secondly, because right now we are experiencing a rather interesting moment. The generation of victors, the generation of war participants, and even those who simply witnessed it as children, is passing away, and soon there will be no eyewitnesses left who can tell us what the Nazi occupation was like, what plans the Nazis were actually making. The people who saw this with their own eyes are leaving us. And at this moment, it is very important to create a strictly scientific narrative about what happened during the Great Patriotic War, about what the Red Army saved our people and our country from, in whatever form its statehood existed. And it is precisely at this turning point that I wanted to contribute my own word to the formalization of this historical memory. Because at the family level, it undoubtedly existed, but at the state level, unfortunately, did not. It wasn't in the textbooks, it wasn't in the movies for the last 30 years, yes, after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It wasn't in the textbooks, it wasn't in the movies, and politicians practically never talked about it. It wasn't in museum exhibitions, it wasn't present in memorial policy, and as far as I can tell, this raised questions and caused pain for quite a lot of people.
But why specifically genocide? Isn't it enough to simply acknowledge that there was the Nuremberg trials, that the Nazis were condemned, that Nazism as a whole was condemned? Why genocide?
Well, here we'll have to go back to the origins to start delving into the history of the terminology and the development of ideas about what the Nazis actually did in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. Let's start with the definition of the term genocide. Genocide as a term, specifically a legal one, appeared only after the Second World War, in the 1940s, and even more so in the 1930s. Such a legal term did not exist. It was legally established in the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide of December 9, 1948. That is, only in 1948, already after the end of the Nuremberg trials.
It was probably applied to Israel, to the Jews, right?
Well, the convention itself does not specify against whom it applies. And I will now talk about the author of this term, Raphael Lemkin, and about what he meant, which genocides he personally recognized. But the convention does not point to any specific genocides. It only sets out the definition of genocide and the forms in which it can be carried out. So what is genocide? According to the United Nations, genocide is actions committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part an ethnic, racial, national, or religious group as such. That is the definition. I want to immediately draw your attention to two very important details. Genocide is not just any destruction of a people, not just any killing of members of a particular group, but only such destruction that is carried out with the intent to destroy them. In other words, if a people perished, but it happened as a result of some accidental or unintentional actions, it is still a crime. But it is not genocide. That's one point.
For example, what the Americans did to the Native American population is in fact not considered genocide.
It is genocide. Let me explain why. Because the American settlers who carried out this destruction had a clear intention, not just genocide, clear intention to get rid of the Native Americans by destroying them.
Turns out the historical period is not essential here.
The historical period is not essential, but during the conquest of the Wild West, there were specific criminal acts that cannot be considered genocide because they do not meet the legal definition. For example, under President Andrew Jackson, the so-called 5 civilized tribes were deported. This deportation was carried out using barbaric methods. For example, this includes the deportation of the Cherokee, the deportation of the Seminoles. They were simply driven out beyond the Mississippi from fertile lands that were intended for Americans, for white settlers. And this was an absolutely barbaric act, as a result of which, for example, a quarter or perhaps even a larger part of the Cherokee people perished. There were a total of 20,000 people, and at least 5,000 died. But we have no evidence that President Jackson gave the order to organize the deportation in such a way that these people would die. So in this case, it doesn't mean that it was a good thing. It doesn't mean that it wasn't a crime, but it is called something else. This is ethnic cleansing. If we were to suddenly discover in the archives a secret order from Andrew Jackson stating that the deportation should be organized in such a way that these people would die in as great a number as possible, or at least in some number, then we could call this genocide as genocide. As long as there is no such order, we cannot prove intent. Accordingly, this is ethnic cleansing, not genocide. And this can be applied to any case of ethnic cleansing. For example, to those deportations that took place during the Great Patriotic War against the peoples of the Soviet Union, such as the deportation of the Kalmyks or the Crimean Tatars. The deportations, the acts of ethnic cleansing. But in no way is this genocide. In other words, it cannot be defined as such. And the overwhelming majority of genocide experts do not define it that way. The same applies, for example, to some well-known cases of famine in world history. For instance, the Great Potato Famine in Ireland, which occurred in the 19th century. It happened because a harmful organism was introduced. The potato crop failed. Ireland began to suffer from famine. In theory, England could have taken some measures to save the Irish. And some individual English officials and even English landlords did help the native population. But these efforts were not enough. That is, England as a state did not make sufficient efforts to save the Irish. This led to the famous Irish immigration of that era, as a result of which, for example, the Kennedy clan ended up in the United States of America. And the mortality rate in Ireland was enormous. But again, we can hardly call this genocide because we cannot establish that the English ruling elite intended through this famine to make the Irish die out. Accordingly, this cannot be called genocide, although without a doubt it is indeed a very appalling and deeply disturbing story, and the actions of the English government were certainly criminal, but not by any reasonable measure truly genocidal.
So it turns out that after the establishment of this legal term genocide, some events, specific events in certain notable cases were still, in fact, ultimately given this legal definition that it was indeed truly genocide.
Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Let me finish first. I drew attention to the issue of intent when defining genocide. We need to look at whether there is intent directed at a specific people. Today, in legal practice and in historical research, this is key. That's why we distinguish genocide from other types of crimes. Let me emphasize again, if there was no intent, that doesn't mean everything was fine.
I see, yes.
A crime is just a different crime. We use this marker to distinguish one from the other. And the second point is also very important, in whole or in part. Genocide is considered not only the attempt to totally destroy an ethnic group or a nation, but also, for example, to destroy a part of it for some specific purposes. This is also very important to understand. So let's make a note of it. Now, let's talk about the forms in which genocide can be carried out. This is also very important because ordinary people often perceive genocide as direct killing. But that's not the case. The convention identifies 5 very different forms, which can occur individually or in combination. The first is direct killing. That's the most straightforward, right? The second is inflicting serious bodily harm on a group with the aim of its subsequent destruction. The third is creating such social conditions under which the group automatically dies out. For example, organizing famine or a humanitarian catastrophe in Palestine. The third force is the interruption of a nation's reproduction, usually carried out in the form of mass sterilization. And the fifth is the abduction of children for the purpose of transferring them from one group to another.
You mean abduction as a state policy?
Yes. As a state policy, when children are taken from the families of a specific people and transferred to another ethnic or national group, for example.
I think every parent's heart just clenched.
Yes, and now I'll show that all of this has been used repeatedly and is still being used today. But it's very important to understand that genocide takes different forms. It can be very different. So now, regarding the question you asked, which was a good one, what did Raphael Lemkin mean when he coined the term genocide? By the way, that's very interesting. Raphael Lemkin didn't mean only that. Lemkin also intended to include cultural genocide in the Genocide Convention. In other words, it's a measure of cognitive reformatting of an ethnic group or nation, as a result of which it loses its self-identification, right? That is, it's the prohibition of language, the banning of culture, the destruction of cultural objects, and so on. But this was not included in the convention. It wasn't included as well. Mainly, the Western powers opposed such an interpretation that would criminalize these measures. Because if this had been criminalized, the Western powers would have faced serious problems. But we have to tell it objectively. And the Soviet Union also had its own veto power, and it used it on one of the proposed aspects as well. In particular, there were discussions about whether to include the destruction of a political group, a group targeted for political reasons, in the definition of genocide. So the Soviet Union rejected this proposal, and that's why the Genocide Convention we have today, on the one hand, does not take political groups into account, which is actually correct, because after all, that's not the destruction of a people, right?
Of course.
On the other hand, it also does not take into account this so-called cultural genocide, which is sometimes referred to in global academic circles by the rather awkward and, in my view, very irrelevant term ethnocide. Here, it's not clear what exactly is being discussed. More often, it is called cultural genocide, and it is also not criminalized, although without a doubt, it also contributes to the destruction of a people. And very often, as was the case, in particular, with Nazi practices, this cultural genocide is planned and goes hand in hand with methods of physical extermination. So who, in Raphael Lemkin's opinion, was subjected to genocide? Raphael Lemkin generally believed, and he was absolutely right in this, that genocide had been practiced since time immemorial. There were quite a few examples of this. For instance, Raphael Lemkin wrote an article about the extermination of the Tasmanian Aborigines, which truly stands as a very rapid an extremely horrific example of genocide. But what did Lemkin think about the Second World War? Naturally, Lemkin actually began using this term in a descriptive sense back in the 1930s, inspired by the massacre of the Armenians by the Turks. Yes, that was in 1915, the massacre of the Armenian population in Turkey. And of course, what happened during the Second World War had a very profound impact on him. And of course, he spoke about the extermination of the Jews, but not only them. In particular, he talked about the destruction of Slavic peoples, specifically mentioning Russians, Ukrainians, and Poles. And in Raphael Lemkin's mind, there was no competition between these peoples as victims. Raphael Lemkin quite rightly drew a distinction in the causality between the extermination of the Jews and, for example, the extermination of Russians and Poles. And he pointed out, again correctly, that the reason for the extermination of the Jews was purely racial. And I will talk about this a bit later. The reason for the extermination of Russians and Poles was that the Germans wanted to seize the land on which these peoples lived. In other words, Hitler's concept during the invasion was the concept of living space. This territory, Poland, the Soviet Union up to the Urals, was viewed as living space for the Germans, for the Aryans, and accordingly there was no place for the indigenous peoples there. They had to be removed from there by any means, including physical extermination. And this is, let's say, a different type of genocide.
And the fight against communism was a major factor here.
Yes. The fight against communism undoubtedly played a very significant role. This is a very complex issue that needs to be examined in detail because too little attention is paid to the Nazi worldview, which linked the supposed racial inferiority of the Russian people to the fact that they embraced communism. Because, well, why did they become that way? Why was the revolution of 1917 successful? Why was the Soviet regime established? Because, well, first of all, there are biological carriers of the Bolshevik idea, that is the Jews. They were the battering ram, the driving force of this revolution, but they found their social base among the Russians, because Russians are also a people of an inferior race, an inferior people, who for the most part consist of Untermenschen. Untermensch is not a Jew. It's important to understand that these concepts, although sometimes mixed together, are not exactly the same. Subhuman. Yes, subhuman means a person with diseased blood, with thin blood, with some absolutely repulsive non-Aryan blood. Because of this non-Aryan blood, he cannot fit into a normal social order or partake in the benefits of normal European culture. That is why he's constantly rebelling against this order. And so the Jews in Russia found such a large number of subhumans to serve as their helpers and accomplices. That is why a revolution happened there and why this satanic, anti-human, anti-European state system exists. That was the logic. In other words, if you are a communist, then you are a subhuman. This is not strictly a social concept. It is a socio-racial concept. That is, you adhere to this ideology because you are genetically and biologically inferior. That's it. By the way, this connection was made in his works, not initially by a German racial theorist, but by an American, Lothrop Stoddard, who coined the term Untermensch. And originally it was in English as Underman, then it was translated into German and became known from the works of German racial theorists and politicians as Untermensch. And the combination of all this is the SS propaganda brochure Untermensch from 1942, which is quite well known. Undoubtedly, the fight against communism, which was also in part involved, was intertwined and connected with the idea, with the racial theory, the idea of racial inferiority. But in this case, since we are specifically discussing genocide, this does not mean that communists were not exterminated, they were. Since in this case we are specifically discussing genocide, and genocide based on ethnicity, that is what we will focus on. A communist, after all, is a political group. During our conversation today, I briefly mentioned this particular point in passing, but perhaps if you agree, we can take some time to discuss it in more detail separately. What do you think? So the meaning of what genocide is, that's clear, right? What genocide is. And the Genocide Convention, it was specifically mentioned in the preamble that genocides had occurred before. In other words, it's not that genocide is a crime that only appeared after 1948. The point is that genocides have occurred throughout human history since time immemorial. But only since 1948 has the international community agreed to make efforts first to try to prevent them by developing an early warning system for genocides, and second, if they do occur, to punish those responsible. That is the essence of this convention. How should punishment be carried out? This is a very interesting question. Punishing genocide is a major problem, if only because the Genocide Convention was adopted and ratified by far from all countries in the 1940s and 1950s. The most interesting thing in this whole legal story is that the country which determined international policy for half the world did not join the Genocide Convention at that time. That country is the United States of America. Why didn't it join? Because at that moment, the issue with the black population was extremely acute. It's clear that World War II and the exposure of Nazi crimes gave a huge impetus to decolonization, not only external decolonization, so to speak, but also the internal struggle for the rights of the black population. And Martin Luther King emerged precisely on the wave of these trends. Human rights organizations within the United States themselves in the early 1950s put forward the concept that genocide was being committed against black people. This was carried out both in the form of direct killings by the Ku Klux Klan and in the form of organizing a social existence in which black people were placed in deliberately worse conditions and were dying out. A special brochure was published titled, "We Accuse of Genocide." It was read from the podium of the United Nations. There was a major scandal, and under the circumstances, the United States refused to join the Genocide Convention. They only joined it at the end of the 1980s. And now I want to draw your attention to a very important fact. The Genocide Convention actually began to be applied. Only can you guess when? It only actually began to be applied in the 1990s. That is, the first genocides recognized under the convention and the first individuals convicted under the United Nations Convention were those convicted in the 1990s. Since then, two genocides have been officially recognized. The genocide in Rwanda, the genocide of the Tutsi people by the Hutu people in Rwanda. And the second one, it's easy to recognize those, right? Well, they're far away. And the other genocide is also, in fact, political, which, by the way, the Russian Federation does not recognize. We didn't have a special resolution regarding Rwanda, probably because it's not within the sphere of interest of the Russian Federation. It seems to me that Russian authorities have never commented on this, but they have spoken out about the second genocide recognized by the UN in the 1990s. This is the genocide of Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica, which took place in 1995. There really was a massacre there. But the question of whether this can be recognized as genocide, or whether it is still a crime against humanity, whether there was intent to destroy based on religious or ethnic grounds, remains open. The UN recognized it. The Russian Federation holds the opinion that this was a crime against humanity, but not genocide. Nevertheless, the UN officially recognized it. In the 1990s, the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide began to be officially applied in our country. And it was applied twice in cases where genocide was recognized. The very first person convicted of genocide was Jean-Paul Akayesu, a criminal from Rwanda, who was not the main perpetrator, by the way, but one of the participants in the Tutsi massacre who was convicted of genocide in the late 1990s.
And in relation to the Jews, even? Or is that already considered a matter of historical record?
Yes, in relation to the Jews there is no mechanism that would recognize at the international level, or rather. There is no clear mechanism that would recognize at the international level historical genocides. Those genocides that occurred before 1948, as a rule, their recognition is carried out either in UN General Assembly resolutions or in statements by influential politicians holding high positions in the United Nations, or their recognition is carried out through special resolutions of parliaments, or again by acting politicians of certain countries. Well, for example, we know that Armenia fought for a long time for the recognition of the Armenian genocide.
Yes.
And so a wave of recognition, this may sound unexpected, but a wave of recognition of the Armenian genocide takes place in the 2010s of the 21st century. Germany recognized it in 2015, if I remember correctly, and Portugal in 2019. Yes, so several European countries recognized the massacre of Armenians specifically as genocide right before our very eyes.
So do we consider this an official genocide as well?
It is absolutely a recognized genocide. And in fact, among genocide scholars, it is considered, are there genocide scholars? Of course, in the West, this is a highly respected field of science. There are specialized academic journals dedicated exclusively to the study of genocides. For example, Omar Bartov, or Dirk Moses, or Adam Jones. There are textbooks on genocide, and in fact, they existed in the Soviet Union as well. At least 2 manuals were published in the USSR. One of them is more of a collection of articles, but it's very substantial, very in-depth, and highly academic. It was published in 1985 under the editorship of the leading expert on Nazism and German fascism, Alexander Abramovich Galkin. This publication is practically not outdated and can only be recommended. But I'll repeat once again, in the West, this is a very, very mainstream topic studied by many specialists with very extensive discussions.
Question of Palestine too. Is it being raised as genocide?
Of course, of course. Well, first of all, the issue of Palestine is being brought up at the International Court of Justice of the UN. This can easily be tracked, yes, by following current events. There are a lot of publications on this topic. And of course, the issue of Palestine is in the spotlight for genocide specialists, including the genocide scholars I mentioned, such as Omar Bartov. If anyone is interested, there is a long interview with him on YouTube where he explains why what is happening in Palestine is genocide. Just so you know, Omar Bartov is Jewish American. He teaches at Brown University and is a highly respected figure. Adam Jones, the author of a key textbook on genocide that is used to teach this subject in Western universities, has also spoken extensively about Palestine and so on. But there are experts who believe that this is not genocide, and all of this is easy to find on Google, so I won't go into detail here. In addition, there are ongoing discussions within national cultures about whether genocides have occurred in their own histories. First of all, actually, one of the leaders in genocide studies is somewhat unexpectedly a Western country, but not the USA. What do you think? Which country is it?
Belgium? Dmitry Yuryevich was just talking about Belgium.
Interesting choice. Yes, there was the extermination of the indigenous population of the Congo, which is still debated whether there was intent or if it was simply that no one cared about these savages. But it's not Belgium, it's Australia. In Australia, genocide studies are indeed highly developed. And Dirk Moses, whom I mentioned earlier, is not just a leading expert on genocide in general, but specifically on a particular type of genocide known as colonial genocide, that is genocide carried out in the colonies. In the 1990s, a special commission was established there to examine a very important issue. This issue concerned the abduction of Aboriginal children for the purpose of raising them within European culture. A specific term emerged in Western historiography in relation to these children. This term is stolen generations, meaning lost generations. And yes, stolen, yes. So the commission that dealt with the history of these children in its resolution called this genocide.
Are there any interesting stories, even just about these children? Are there, for example, any well-known people who became descendants or who themselves were taken away in this way? Surely there must be some...
Yes, of course, of course. Probably the most famous story is that of a girl named Molly Craig. Molly was abducted at the age of 14 in Australia and taken to a special camp for such children, 1,600 kilometers away from her home. Together with her half-sister and cousin, She was, yes. It was primarily mixed-race children who were abducted. And she was the daughter of a white man and an Aboriginal woman. So she was kidnapped and taken far, far away. The very next day, she escaped. She ran away and covered this enormous distance. She walked along the rabbit-proof fence. A special fence had been built there to keep out rabbits. So she walked along it together with her friends and relatives and finally made it back home.
Wow.
So later she had a very tragic fate, because after that she grew up, married an Aboriginal man, had children, and then she was taken away again, this time brought to that camp along with her daughters. Why were they kidnapped? Because there was this idea that they needed to be whitened, so to speak. That is, they were isolated from the Aboriginal community, monitored, and then given up for adoption to some white Australian families. And then it was necessary to make sure that they married white people. And then, after a few generations, Aboriginal features would disappear. That was the concept. It was an absolutely official, visible government policy. Molly Craig was separated from her two daughters. She had already given birth to her two daughters, and her eldest daughter, Doris Pilkington Garimara, became a very famous Australian writer. She found her mother after 21 years, and she wrote a book on this subject, which is considered a masterpiece of contemporary Australian literature, which is called, yes, it's a work of fiction. It's called Follow the Rabbit-Proof Fence. This book was adapted into a film. The movie was released, I think, in 2002, I believe. In 2002, it caused a huge public outcry, both in Australia and beyond. There was a major scandal about it. The role of the person who put forward this concept of child abductions, inspector responsible for overseeing such children, in fact, for overseeing Aboriginal people in Western Australia, whose last name was Neville, his role is played superbly by Kenneth Brown. That's it. This is a story that became very widely known. That's why Doris Pilkington, who recently passed away, was one of the heirs to this tragedy of the stolen generations. So, of course, there are certainly such people, but this problem is not unique to Australia. For example, it is also a very acute issue in Canada. And there, too, there are currently major debates among intellectuals about these children were also taken away there and sent to special institutions. And the conditions in these institutions were terrible. It is highly likely that there was widespread, the fact that there was widespread abuse there is certain. That is no longer in doubt. It is possible that there were also mass killings of these children, because just recently burial sites were discovered. It's unclear what these burial sites are, mass graves of children that no one knew anything about. These burials were secret. Why weren't these people buried in a cemetery? What was happening there is completely unclear.
But if we go back to the Soviet Union, as you mentioned, in all these forms, genocide was essentially taking place.
Yes, now we're getting to that. Let's talk about the verdict of the International Nuremberg Tribunal. As I already mentioned, the term genocide did not exist at that time. The verdict used the term crimes against humanity. Nowadays, these terms are distinguished in such a way that crimes against humanity are considered crimes against individuals, while genocide is a crime against a group. That's it. But if we carefully read the charter of the International Tribunal at Nuremberg, we see that crimes such as the destruction of peoples were specifically classified as crimes against humanity. So what crimes against humanity did the tribunal identify in the actions of the Nazis? It specifically found that in the Soviet Union and Poland, the Nazis committed all their atrocities not only to suppress resistance, but also in order to completely eliminate the peoples living on those lands so that they could later fully colonize these territories with Germans. In other words, the International Nuremberg Tribunal essentially determined that there was a plan to destroy these peoples, and that this plan was connected to specific crimes. So in essence, it established that genocide had taken place, even though that term did not yet exist. But in essence, the International Nuremberg Tribunal defined what is now included in the definition of genocide. We owe thanks to our Soviet ancestors. Yes, absolutely. So people often ask, why didn't the Soviet Union demand recognition of genocide? While the Soviet Union existed, the term genocide was subordinate to the term crimes against humanity. During the existence of the Soviet Union, the Convention on Genocide was not actually applied. There was the verdict of the International Nuremberg Tribunal, where the plan to exterminate the peoples of the USSR and the connection of this plan to specific actions were recognized, and for that legal and political situation, this was entirely sufficient. Changes began to occur specifically in the 1990s. In the 1990s, when the convention began to be applied, and as one of the very well-known Western genocide scholars said, it was precisely the recognition of genocide that became the gold standard. It sort of began to prevail over the term crimes against humanity. Naturally, during this same period, a huge number of documents were declassified with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Soviet and German archives were opened up, and a great deal became known. and much more became known about the Holocaust, because the Holocaust, of course, had been studied, but not the Holocaust on the territories occupied by the USSR. There were very few such studies because there were very few sources. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was simply an explosion. Everyone became interested in this. All over the world, people began to study what happened in the USSR, how Jews were exterminated in the USSR. Before that moment, the date marking the beginning of the extermination of the Jews was very often called January 20, 1942. This is the Wannsee Conference, where the final extermination of the Jews in Europe was agreed upon. These are the Jews of Europe. By that time, Babi Yar had already happened. By that time, many Jews on the territory of the USSR had already been exterminated. A very active study began. Israel supported all of this, and quite rightly so. That is, all of this, without a doubt, needs to be studied. This genocide did happen. It was monstrous and the most systematic. And the death camps built on the territory of Poland, which was occupied by the Nazis, were constructed primarily for the extermination of Jews. And more Soviet prisoners of war, Poles, were also killed there, right? But the largest number, so to speak, of those killed in these camps were Jews. Well, just take Auschwitz as an example, right? It is believed that 1.1 million people were killed in Auschwitz, and about 1 million of them were Jews. This doesn't mean that others weren't killed, but others were mostly killed by different methods. Death camps were primarily for Jews, and specifically the gas chambers were used mainly for Jews. Films appeared, like Schindler's List and other movies that told the story of this terrible genocide. And in Germany in particular, the idea took shape that the most horrific crime of Nazism, something that cannot be compared to anything else, is precisely the Holocaust. And it's not just considered the most terrible crime of Nazism, but actually the most terrible crime in general, the most horrific, I think, even here with us, genocide, yes. And well, we had this view as well. And not without reason, because it is believed that 6 million Jews were killed. Maybe the number is a bit lower, like 5,800,000. But this doesn't make any fundamental difference. About half of these people were citizens of the Soviet Union. So to ignore the Holocaust is simply absurd. It undoubtedly happened here. Right now, we are in St. Petersburg, yes, in Leningrad. The nearest Holocaust site is the city of Pushkin, which, by the way, was part of Leningrad. Already back then, in 1941, the Germans entered and began exterminating the Jews. There weren't very many of them there, about 300 people, but they were shot almost immediately after the occupation began. And this monstrous genocide, monstrous not only because of the scale of the victims, but also because of its bureaucratic organization and systematic nature, made such an impression on the world that it seemed to overshadow the suffering of other nations. But then historians who studied the genocide of the Jews, as they gradually delved deeper into the material, realized that this was not the only genocide carried out by the Nazis, nor the only extermination program, and they began to write about other Nazi crimes as well. This happened first and foremost in Germany. A great deal has been written about this in Germany. And if you talk to we talk to German historians, despite all the complexities of the political situation, if you talk to German historians, a significant number of them, including very respected figures, like, for example, Goetz-Allee, a true classic in the field of historical science, agreed that the Nazis carried out not just one genocide, not just two against Jews and Roma, but 3 genocides, yes, including against Slavs as well. This is an absolutely respected point of view in Western, well, specifically in German academic scholarship. Not among political circles, but specifically within academic scholarship. But take Dirk Moses, whom I've already mentioned as he reflects on this topic. He even stated that when a historian or researcher looks at the Holocaust, they become petrified, as if gazing upon Medusa the Gorgon. He calls this the Gorgon effect. And having turned to stone, they fail to notice other genocides, even though those also occurred. And it is very important to study other genocides as well, because the uniqueness of the Holocaust also means that it is the least likely to be repeated. But other genocides, which were less systematic, less bureaucratic, yet nonetheless actually carried out, yes, resulting in the destruction of peoples, can be repeated, and moreover, are already being repeated right before our eyes. That is why it is necessary to study them, because this study is not just, so to speak, a reflection on what happened in the past, but an ongoing search for solutions that will help us prevent genocides in the future.
But from a legal point of view, if we talk about the sanctions that might follow, then again, what is the purpose?
Because no sanctions will follow from this, nor can any follow. I would be very surprised if that happens. I think the Russian state supports this for 2 or perhaps even 3 distinct reasons. In fact, as I see it, the first reason is that in one way or another, the people who currently hold high-ranking positions of authority are the children and grandchildren of those who became or could have become victims of genocide But I just know this, yes, that many people who are making decisions today related to the siege of Leningrad, their ancestors survived that siege. And for them, this is not just a figure of speech. For them, it's a serious emotional experience that, well, creates a need to reflect on it. That's one of the reasons. Right? The second reason is about, well, pursuing the correct historical policy. Because, as I already said, the generation of victors is passing away, and this isn't written about in the textbooks. At the moment, there's only a small window of opportunity left to manage to fix this. And the third reason, as I see it, is that there is a certain pressure from below. It seems to me that people, well, wanted this. Because when I started recording my videos, I received an enormous amount of feedback. Since 2015, there has just been a flood of messages from people of all ages. School children, students, men, women, young people, and the elderly all wrote about this. One veteran of the Great Patriotic War wrote to Mecha, was 92 years old, was grateful. So, in other words, there was a kind of oblivion surrounding this tragedy. And people, well, I hope this doesn't sound too pretentious, but I got the impression that the general public wanted this to be voiced. Because when this was kept silent, it wasn't just that people were silent scientists, for example, simply didn't write about it. Very little was written about it in the 90s and the 2000s, unlike in Germany. But if we look at the media, there was a lot of nihilism toward the tragedy, a great deal of nihilism, truly. Why was the discussion received so painfully? Survey on the TV channel, you know exactly which channel I'm talking about. Well, on the Dozhde channel, of course. About whether Leningrad should have been surrendered, right? This caused a huge scandal. The question is, what is the reason for such a reaction? It's a stupid question, because people who did well in school, they know about this. By the way, in school, at least in Leningrad, they talked about this in school. They told me about it. They know that Hitler had given the order not to take Leningrad, even if capitulation was offered. That is, even if Leningrad had surrendered, Hitler would not have entered the city, because the goal was not to capture the city, but to starve the troops and the population inside, to get rid of that population. This was well known, and a large number of people are aware of it. The very posing of such a question immediately reeks of lies and hypocrisy, and that's what provoked such a painful reaction. And the same applies to many other things. For example, there was a very well-known influential article by Alexander Mink entitled "Whose Victory?", in which all the casualties of the Great Patriotic War were attributed to Stalin. It was stated outright there that Hitler killed people in the death camps. And the implication was that he killed the Jews, and all the other victims were Stalin's victims. But that's not true, certainly. And here's a remarkable thing. I have a book here in my library. Artem Drabkin, our friend, runs a wonderful project called I Remember. It's a collection of interviews with veterans of the Great Patriotic War. One of these interviews is truly remarkable, absolutely piercing, an interview with Remal Scholler. He's Jewish by origin, yes, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War. Here he recalls his most terrifying impression of the war. He was a young lieutenant recovering in a hospital and then returned to the army. And so the first assignment he receives, they send him somewhere, he doesn't really know where, traveling by train with his fellow soldiers. And he says, strangely, they fed us very well. We arrived somewhere on the border of the Pskov region and the Baltics. They fed us again, and it became clear that we hadn't come to the front. Why were they taking us there? I didn't understand. Then they divided us into groups and sent us to burned out villages. And so we arrived at these burned out villages. The task was to retrieve corpses from the wells. As part of their scorched earth policy, the Germans would leave and kill the entire population. That was the most terrifying thing, because people would just lose their minds and say, we're not going down there again. Some NKVD officer ran over, started threatening us, yelling. He had an order. Understood. And I told him, could you go down there yourself even once? Go ahead. He said that after that we couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't do anything. Later I went to Auschwitz and to other places, but I never saw anything more horrifying than that moment. And then Altschuler says, why don't they talk about this? Why don't they mention the General Plan Ost and so on? We supposedly have a commission for protecting Russia from the falsification of history, but on this silence. And this interview is from 2011, and it's true. They kept silent about this. They kept silent about it, and it gave the impression of some kind of conspiracy, general silence, as if we shouldn't remember this and so on. And that's why I think there was this pressure from below. There was a vivid, clear desire among people for this topic to finally be brought out of this conspiracy of silence.
And against the backdrop of this entire liberal media agenda, which was constantly engaged in smearing our country while at the same time pushing pro-Western narratives. And when against this background some historical truth, some historical reality appears, it's like a breath of fresh air for people. Because they say, see, there it is. I'm not the only one who thinks this way somewhere in my own kitchen.
I think that this is exactly, if we're talking about some kind of liberal agenda, then it's specifically an internal liberal agenda. Because in the West, there is a completely reasonable discussion about genocide. These crimes have been the focus of attention for German, British, and American historians. Entire libraries have been written on this subject. The term hunger plan or hunger policy was mainstream in Western scholarship in the 2010s, where the hunger plan referred to directives on economic policy that involved the planned extermination of 20 to 30 million people in the territory of Great Russia through deliberately organized famine for both economic and ethnic reasons. In these directives, it is stated explicitly that the Great Russians, whether under the Tsar or the Bolsheviks, are the main enemies of Germany and Europe, and therefore we will not feed them, they must die. This is a description of that very genocide, and it is an actual directive. So this is something that was officially adopted for implementation, right? This is a description of that very genocidal intent that is required according to the United Nations Convention. So when I published them, they were released with quotations. And when I published their full text in Russian, people openly started saying, no, these aren't directives. This is just departmental analysis. Well, this isn't departmental analysis. These are directives on the basis of which other orders were issued, and for a wide range of agencies, including the Wehrmacht. And some people, so to speak, who were, in a sense, behind the scenes with me would often tell me, no, why are you pushing this? Because it's not good, because if genocide is recognized, it will turn out that the communist government actually saved the people from genocide.
And then we won't be invited to the conference.
And then, yes, the concept in the state will be different, and the communist government won't seem so bad anymore, so to speak. So why pour water on the mill of destructive forces? What are you doing? I've heard this with my own ears, that this is whitewashing Stalin. I say, but it's the truth. After all, these Nazi plans really existed. Whether you like Stalin or not, it was Stalin as the supreme commander-in-chief and the Red Army under his command, and, well, the Soviet people as a whole, yes, who broke these plans. So in order to satisfy your political ambitions, you want me to lie? They say yes. Why? Well, you just shouldn't. You don't have to lie, just, don't say anything, don't get involved, and so on. And then the concept, well, it wasn't officials who said this, of course. It was said by scholars, yes, people with academic degrees.
That's exactly what I wanted to say, that usually these kinds of things, my impression is the same in economists, it doesn't come from officials. That is, no one tells you well. The higher-ups don't call you in, they don't say, hey, stop that. No, it usually all comes from people just like you who say to you, where are you going? Why are you doing this? Don't you know what our policy is? Just follow the way it's supposed to be, as you've been told. When the policy changes, then we'll do things differently, but for now, don't.
And then the policy changed, and everyone rushed off. I rushed off too, yes. Now the policy really has changed, and the concept is different.
Fortunately, it's the same for me. So if before we talked about planning, about strategic planning, and this, well, something that needs to be applied, for example, in our country, it was always perceived, well, not always, but back then it was perceived like, what planning? Are we going back to the Soviet days? That's how it was. But now it's become so much
a respectable point of view. Let's discuss it.
Yes, many people are already talking about this. There are historical examples, and it's quite possible now to publish works on this topic. Scientific journals that used to reject such work no longer do so. Now, please, it's allowed.
Yes, of course, everything depends a lot on the political climate. But everything depends on that except for one thing. This is real science. That is, the existence of these genocidal plans and their connection to the extermination of the Soviet population is objective. It doesn't depend on whether we acknowledge it or not. As I already mentioned, this was actually the mainstream view in Western scholarship in the 2010s. But why? Because there used to be the Cold War. That too was for objective reasons, because there used to be the Cold War. Within the framework of the Cold War, it was possible to study the extermination of the Jews, and it was necessary to study the extermination of the Jews. And this was indeed an important topic, because the extermination of the Jews was also, in fact, something that people tried to hush up, or at the very least, place the blame solely on Hitler and the SS. For example, if, let's say, something was written about the SS and the death camps, then, for instance, the participation of the Wehrmacht in the extermination of the Jews was not written about even in Germany up to a certain point. Why? Because the myth of the clean Wehrmacht prevailed. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht is the idea that all the crimes were committed by the SS. And the Wehrmacht fought a chivalrous war. Your grandfathers and grandmothers are not to blame for anything, as long as they didn't serve in the SS. They fought an honest war against much more dangerous opponents, against the Bolsheviks opponents, whom, in fact, we are still fighting now in the Cold War. That was the narrative.
Yes.
Exactly. But gradually, so to speak, this narrative was being dismantled because he participated in the extermination of Jews and was very effective in assisting the SS with this. And many officials were aware of it. But when the Berlin Wall fell, it became possible to study other extermination programs as well. That's why, well, and historians, they always strive. What is our task? To say something new, to somehow contribute new knowledge to science. That's why German historians rushed to study a topic that had previously been taboo, and they did it brilliantly. We should be very grateful to German historical scholarship for making a tremendous contribution to the study of extermination policies in the East.
So is this something that the FRG or the GDR did? Or when you say German, who do you mean?
So here's the situation. Right now, I'm talking about the post-Soviet period, so we're already dealing with a unified Germany. Of course, in the GDR and FRG, there were completely different perceptions of Nazi policy. In the GDR, for example, there was no myth of a clean Wehrmacht at all, and quite a lot of very good work was written about this. For example, there's the excellent monograph by Norbert Müller, The Wehrmacht and the Occupation. Collections of documents from GDR archives about Nazi crimes were also published, but even so, all of this was still incomplete for two reasons. First, because a significant portion of the documents in German once ended up in the FRG. Second, because an even larger portion of the documents is scattered across archives in a wide variety of countries. Some documents on the same topic can be found in the former territory of the USSR. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, the USA, England, the FRG, Romania, Hungary, and Finland. And in order to get a complete picture, you need to study documents from the archives of all these countries. And this only became possible recently because many of these documents have started to be digitized, and we have been able to see what is located where. And the fourth reason why the topic of genocide has become so relevant is that new documents are being released, declassified, digitized, and we can now see them.
So you've already mentioned that the famine was organized and that the blockade of Leningrad was organized. But still, even if we briefly go through all these points, well, it's...
Of course, yes. This, of course, would require a separate video. But let's do this. Now, briefly, the first thing I want to clarify for our viewers is the difference between the genocide of the Jews and the genocide of Russians, Ukrainian Soviet Slavs. When I talk about Slavs, I mean the Slavs of the Lebensraum. These are four peoples: Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and of course Poles. No matter what the current relationship between Russia and Poland is, Poles were also victims of Nazi genocide. And Poland was also considered part of the Lebensraum for the German nation. This needs to be understood very clearly. This difference, in fact, was first noticed by Raphael Lemkin. And he showed that the Jews were exterminated. How? Exclusively for racial reasons. Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians were exterminated because the land was being cleansed of them. This was a classic colonial genocide. There are, let's say, two types of genocide. One type of genocide can be called implosive, that is, directed inward at one's own society. This is a genocide in which a certain minority is suddenly, or not so suddenly, identified as unacceptable and hostile, and is destroyed by the majority. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Lemkin himself gave such an example. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, the extermination of the Huguenots in France, is also genocide. The Armenians exterminated by the majority, the Turks. This is a genocide of that type, right? And the extermination of Jews in Europe is also a genocide of this kind. But there is also a colonial extermination, which is carried out against some external group, not an internal group, but an external one. As a rule, it happens with the aim of seizing the land belonging to this group and the resources of that land. This includes the extermination of the Tasmanians, the Aboriginal Australians, and the Native Americans, primarily the Native Americans of California. By the way, this is a genocide that has been officially recognized by the authorities of the state of California. And so the main idea of my work is that what was carried out against Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians is precisely colonial genocide. Moreover, Western experts on colonial genocide often point out that colonial genocide is not usually carried out all at once. Rather, it is a prolonged process that can stretch over decades, sometimes even centuries, taking different forms and combining all 5 forms required by the Genocide Convention. So it makes no sense to talk about the abduction of Jewish children. That didn't happen because the extermination of Jews was carried out rapidly. But in relation to Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, it did happen. It's also pointless to talk about sterilization because, again, Jews were not sterilized. They were simply driven into gas chambers. But with regard to Russians, this was planned. It's pointless to talk about forced abortions in relation to Jews, because again, they were being exterminated immediately. But when it came to Russian ostarbeiters, forced abortions were indeed used because the goal was somewhat different. The idea was that the Russian population needed to be reduced, but at the same time, they had to be made to work. In other words, to exploit Temis, and perhaps this is the most important point in understanding the difference in numbers, there were simply far more Russians. Very often by Russians, the Nazis meant all Slavic peoples, both from the Soviet Union and also other peoples who simply lived in the territories of the Slavic republics. And the Germans had a saying, we are 90 million and they are 190 million. This meant that the enemy was far too numerous and needed to be destroyed. To decimate them, meaning to destroy tens of millions of people from this ethnic group, because that was considered an essential prerequisite for securing German dominance over the conquered lands. And initially, the plan was to use the method of mass sterilization. These studies began in 1941, even before the invasion, and were conducted, by the way, in Auschwitz under the supervision of an SS official named Viktor Hermann Brack. But at the same time, as the attack on the Soviet Union was being planned, another plan was conceived within the Ministry of Agriculture and Food. It proposed a simple way to quickly destroy tens of millions of Soviet citizens in the occupied territories. And it also explained why it was necessary to do this very quickly. This was the very hunger plan I mentioned earlier. The fact is that although the beginning of World War II seemed extremely favorable for Germany, they crushed Poland in 1940 and brought France to its knees. However, there was a nuance. This nuance was that Great Britain used the same strategy it had employed during the First World War. Using its powerful navy, it blockaded the German coast, and the German economy was highly dependent on importing grain from overseas and exporting fertilizers, primarily Chilean nitrate, which increased soil yields. And in fact, the entire leadership of the Reich were either veterans of the First World War, like Hitler and Goering, or they were young people who had lived through that time and remembered how it turned out, like Himmler. And all of them, not without reason, believed that it was hunger, provoked by the British naval blockade, that undermined German fighting spirit and ultimately led to defeat in the First World War. A repeat of that scenario could not be allowed, and the very idea of Lebensraum, which took shape for Hitler back in the 1920s, partly stemmed from this experience as well, because it was precisely the creation of autarky on the European continent German-led, that is, economic self-sufficiency, that was conceived as the guarantee of a great Reich, which would be invincible in the face of any threat. And this was only possible by destroying the Soviet Union or Russia, regardless of its governmental form. The prospect of another British naval blockade greatly concerned German economists and later the political leadership as well, because it became clear that England was not willing to make peace. And if things continued this way, the situation of 1916, 1917 could repeat itself. Hitler was already planning to attack the Soviet Union. It was a plan he had long considered and nurtured. But the British naval blockade influenced the specific timing. Roughly speaking, it set the date for June 22. Thus, the invasion was determined not only by the military plan Barbarossa, but also by an economic plan devised by a man named Herbert Back. He was the state secretary of the Ministry of Agriculture and Food and a native of the Russian Empire. He was born in Batumi. He knew the Russian language and Russian realities very well. His doctoral dissertation was devoted specifically to Russian grain farming. And so his idea was that it was precisely thanks to the Russian and Ukrainian black soil regions, yes, the south of Russia and Ukraine, the North Caucasus, that all of Germany's problems would be solved for the next 100 years. Just like how Guriev is now involved in developing sanctions against Russia because he knows the Russian economy. Is it really the same kind of story? Well, there were quite a few people in the German establishment who came from Russia. The most famous of them is Becker, Alfred Rosenberg, right? But there were also quite a few Baltic or Caucasian Germans who, so to speak, found their place as consultants in Russia. And what role did corporations play in this? Corporations played a huge role in this, but I want to emphasize that after all, corporations were in second place. It wasn't the corporations dictating to Hitler what to do. And I'll explain why. Because Hitler saw himself and Nazi Germany as one big corporation, into which the smaller corporations were integrated. Managers here, yes. Moreover, within the state apparatus itself, another corporation emerged. This corporation was called the SS. It was absolutely a corporation that aimed to make a profit. They kept track of money there very scrupulously. And it was precisely the SS that sought to acquire as many slaves from the East as possible in order to exploit them, produce military and non-military goods, and profit from it. That is, Heinrich Himmler was, without a doubt, an enforcer, an executioner, but at the same time, he was also quite a shrewd businessman. And if we're going to talk about the Holocaust was, among other things, a cannibalistic economic enterprise, because at first, the persecution of Jews was carried out for the purpose of so-called Aryanization. Roughly speaking, Jewish people had their businesses taken away in the broad sense and in the narrow sense, even their property. Then it got to the point of things like gold teeth. Well, if you've killed 6 million people, you can calculate how many gold teeth, so to speak, were melted down into bars and deposited in banks. Swiss banks, which, so to speak, actively cooperated with Nazism. The extermination. I'm going to say something terrible, but the extermination of the Jews was a business enterprise during which the Nazis made a huge profit, including amounts that can be calculated in concrete figures.
Well, this is a very important point about war in general, that it is first and foremost an economic undertaking, which simply used terror as its tool.
Yes, and of course, the corporations you mentioned very quickly adopted this strategy. They quickly integrated themselves into the system, and they were developing plans for exploiting the natural resources of the East, the ore of Donbass, and so on. Naturally, they were very interested in oil, the oil of the Caucasus. There were big plans in this regard. That's why business eagerly found its place in all of this and actively participated in and supported the Nazi regime up to a certain point, as long as it was profitable for them. As soon as Hitler started losing, entrepreneurs immediately tried through their business channels to establish contacts, not with the Soviet Union, of course, but with the Western allies of the USSR in order to discuss the post-war order. The first tentative contacts began after Stalingrad. By 1944, these contacts were already in full swing. So, of course, corporations were involved, but I'm opposed to the simplistic interpretation that corporations, so to speak, were the ones driving Hitler. That's not the case. Hitler himself was the head of a corporation, and Himmler was the head of a corporation. Both of them very much thought in terms of profit. That's it. But getting back to the topic, we started talking about this hunger plan, right? So it's important to understand that this plan took into account the death of 30 million people. And this was not just destruction for economic reasons, like we need to rob Russia and feed our own people, right? But also because Great Russians were seen as the main enemies of Germany and Europe. Regardless of the political regime inherently, regardless of age, gender, personal views, upbringing, and so on, they were regarded as enemies on an ethnic basis and were to be starved to death. This is a genocidal intent. And this genocidal intent was accepted by all the political agencies of the Third Reich, especially the SS. On June 10th, Heinrich Himmler spoke with Backe. After that, he went to the final meeting with his closest associates at Wilsburg Castle. And at this meeting, he told them that the goal of the campaign against Russia was to reduce the Slavic population by 30 million people. This statement is also evidence of genocidal intent. That is, he's not talking about communists, he's not talking about underground fighters, he's not talking about Bolsheviks. In other words, he's not describing a political group, not a group that would resist. He's describing an ethnic group that needs to be radically reduced. And in fact, Heinrich Himmler was not very careful with his words list of all among the Nazi leaders. That is why he left us a wealth of speeches, the content of which includes genocidal intentions. One of these speeches has even survived in audio form. Himmler says that the Russians must be exterminated down to the very last handful. And this is a clear intention of genocide. Moreover, it is absolutely clear from the speech that this intention is not just words, and it is connected to specific crimes that are already being committed on the territory of the Soviet Union. Why is Himmler important? Because Himmler was given police authority over the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. Himmler claimed the right to carry out one of the key aspects of colonial genocide. So how does colonial genocide happen, right? An invasion takes place. The colonizers establish themselves on the land, begin to seize it, push the indigenous people onto less fertile territories, and drive them from their settled homes. And everyday violence begins because from the outset, the colonizer has no interest in these people, so they are beaten and killed, and this carries no consequences or punishment. And naturally, this leads to resistance. In the context of colonial genocide, resistance is a very important factor because the colonizer interprets it not as resistance, but as unprovoked aggression. This aggression leads to punitive operations. But in reality, these are not punitive operations. They are extermination operations because the goal is not to punish a specific culprit, but to destroy as many people as possible and depopulate the territory so that it can later be settled and occupiers can feel safe on the seized land. This is an exact copy of what happened earlier in the colonies. For example, what happened in Tasmania, the same thing. Colonization begins. They seize land, drive out the Aborigines, kill the indigenous people without reason, kidnap and rape women. There, all of this took on especially repugnant forms, because at the forefront of the expansion were convict people with criminal backgrounds, devoid of any moral qualities. The indigenous population begins a liberation struggle. This liberation struggle is interpreted as aggression. The so-called Black War begins, during which colonial troops and settlers completely exterminate the Aborigines, and the remaining survivors are deported to nearby Flinders Island, where they died. This is a kind of colonial genocide in miniature. The same thing happened to the Nama and Hiroti extermination of African tribes in 1904. German settlers in Southwest Africa began seizing land and killing Africans. Africans protested and started an uprising. The uprising was interpreted as unprovoked aggression. An expeditionary corps arrives, and its general commander, Lothar von Trotha, declares that these tribes must be wiped off the face of the earth. Some of them are exterminated, while others are driven into the Omaheke desert, where they are meant to die of hunger and thirst. They are hardly pursued. Instead, blockades are set up at the exits from the desert. If these unfortunate Africans try to reach a water source to drink,
African terrorists. If these African terrorists...
Savages. Back then, terrorists didn't exist. They were called savages. So when the savages try to come out to drink, they're simply not allowed near the water source and are driven back into the bushes.
Literally everything you're saying, I just substitute Gaza in there and I see that it's exactly the same, one-to-one. I was also preparing material on this topic. And you see that it's about eviction from territories and the lack of access to water sources. They literally concrete them over, and all of this is happening right here and now before our eyes.
If we go back to the Soviet Union, what was planned there was simply an expanded version of a genocidal program aimed at a larger number of people over a much greater territory. That's it. So what was the idea? It was that the German army invades. It wages a Varuha war without any rules, a war of annihilation. This war includes the total plundering of the occupied territories and the creation of an organized humanitarian catastrophe, the core of which is hunger. The second core is the destruction of the major cities of Great Russia, because the issues of destroying Leningrad and Moscow were already being discussed as early as May 1941. The goal was to kill some people on the ruins and to drive some people away to the east. Just like in the Mojave Desert, they needed to be driven to the east. But there is no food there, because the economic system of the Soviet Union was such that there was the Black Earth South, which fed the industrial center. In the Soviet Union, this system functioned normally. The Nazis planned to break up this logistics system and redirect all food supplies to provision the Wehrmacht and export them to Germany. Accordingly, the industrial center would starve, and cities would be the first to suffer from hunger. And if the cities are destroyed, the population will flee to the east. This means panic, a war of everyone against everyone else, chaos. And then the Germans would move in, and hunger riots would break out. It was these hunger riots that the SS troops were supposed to suppress. In other words, under the pretext of quelling these hunger riots, they would have to kill even more people. As a result, by winter, about 30 million people would die. This was a genocidal plan. It was never fully implemented, but unfortunately, some fragments of it did come to pass. There are several such fragments. This is the siege of Leningrad. The siege of Leningrad, it was a result of military actions, but initially no siege was planned. The plan was that the Wehrmacht troops, after defeating the Soviet forces in the Baltics, would approach the defenseless city and simply begin destroying it with artillery shelling and carpet bombing from the air. The people in panic would either die as a result of these measures, or in their panic would just flee somewhere, well, anywhere, that's clear. They won't flee into the German rear, the Germans won't let them in. They'll flee to the east, there will be chaos, panic, and most importantly, there won't be any food. And during this time, winter will come, and in winter, naturally, everyone will die of hunger. It would be a terrible disaster. Well, they would only have themselves to blame. And the same goes for Moscow. In other words, the plan was, since they failed to defeat the group in the Baltics, Leningrad was turned into a fortress. Hence the blockade. But the blockade in no way changed the idea of starving the people of Leningrad. That remained an imperative. So the blockade of Leningrad is one part of the genocide, right? The second part of the genocide was the extermination of Soviet prisoners of war by starvation. And the third was the starvation of civilians in the occupied territories, because in all the occupied areas, the Germans' first priority was to establish control over food distribution. They manipulated this. They had no intention of supplying food to the entire population. There was a very clear ethnic hierarchy. That is, they would identify and register, for example, Germans, Soviet Germans, and representatives of allied nations, such as Finns. These people were removed from this genocidal lottery and integrated into the occupation system. They could immediately, simply by virtue of their good blood, receive decent positions and accordingly move up. Second, there were collaborators from the indigenous peoples who were evaluated individually. Well, if someone was considered useful, they would be used accordingly.
For example, to execute their own people.
Yes, for example, for this purpose. Exactly. Well, as for the rest, it was a matter of luck. That is, from the very beginning, it was clear that life on the occupied territories would be a lottery, and some people there would die. Who exactly would die? Yes, that could be determined by how events unfolded. But the fact that there would be high mortality and the reduction in the population was clear to the Nazis from the very start. And naturally, who was dying? It was first and foremost the most vulnerable segments of the population who died, those whom no one cared for. These were children and the elderly. And women as well. And this is actually very important because, child mortality is a crucial, the most important demographic factor. That is, these children definitely will not grow up. And as for the men, well, maybe they won't have any new children either. And they understand that in the prisoner of war camps, men were also exterminated with the same intent. And from the very beginning, these extermination operations were carried out in the event of an uprising. Yes, in 1941, they were not on such a large scale, but nevertheless, the first burned villages were still in 1941. I can say that we are looking at German documents. In the German documents, we find villages that were burned, for example, in the Smolensk region, which were not recorded by the Extraordinary State Commission. Because by the time the Red Army liberated the Smolensk region, no one remembered these burned villages anymore. Small villages, about 40 people, but all of them were killed in 1941, simply because, for example, some Soviet soldiers who were encircled were spotted nearby, and someone from the village had given them a piece of bread. The village was burned, everyone was killed, there are counter-arguments as well, and there's an ongoing debate about whether it was genocide or not. The main counter-argument is that in this case there was a direct reason. People in the village fed the soldiers, and they were killed not because they were Russian, but because they fed the soldiers. Well, in my opinion, that's a very disingenuous explanation. I'll explain why. In that case, for example, with the Jews, you could also say that Jews were not killed as Jews, but as members of an international conspiration, imaginary one, of course, invented by the Nazis that was supposedly out to destroy German national culture. And to a certain extent, the same applied to Russians. In other words, there was a motivation here to blur the motives for extermination. The extermination of Russians was planned at the very top. And only the political elite knew that the outcome of their partial extermination was programmed. This could have gone unnoticed at the platoon commander's level.
We never had anything like that.
A platoon commander, an executioner, but a historian should not look at what happened from the perspective of a punitive platoon commander. He should look at it from above and understand that in the case of the Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, the genocide was organized not by creating extermination camps, but by establishing an occupational regime that continually reproduced the practice of mass killings. And it was assumed that by the end of the war, as a result of this practice of mass killings, the indigenous population would be reduced. This is a truly typical story of colonial genocide, because colonial genocide is rooted in the violence of the invader. Violence always provokes resistance. Resistance is suppressed with excessive violence. As a result, the indigenous population declines. This is a single pattern that was the same in Tasmania, in Australia, in North America, and in Southwest Africa. Hitler knew about this because he was a fan of Westerns. He was very fond of Karl May, a prominent German author of adventure novels. That is, for him, he repeatedly drew parallels with North America. He explicitly said that we will carry out Germanization by bringing in Germans, and we will deal with the local population the same way as with the Indians. These are Hitler's direct words. He was very well aware of the history of genocide in Southwest Africa. When he was young, one of his early mentors was Franz Ritter von Ebb, a participant in the Herero genocide, who joined the Nazi party and was the head of the colonial political department of the NSDAP. And Goering's father, for example, was actually the governor of Southwest Africa. Unlike Hitler, who, so to speak, rose from the lower classes, Goering was a representative of Germany's hereditary political elite. And among Goering Sr.'s friends included people like Cecil Rhodes, the British mining magnate and founder of Rhodesia, and Joseph Chamberlain, a prominent British statesman and colonial administrator. Both of these men were well-known British imperialists who played significant roles in shaping the policies of the British Empire during that era. And Joseph Chamberlain, for those who don't know, is the father of Neville Chamberlain, the man who signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler. So Goering had connections at the level of the international political elite. He was a member of an international elite club that had been dealing with issues of colonization for many years. So these methods were, well, on the one hand, they were connected to the fact that the same model was being implemented. And on the other hand, they were related to the fact that Hitler knew what to do because he had very good teachers.
Yes, advisors.
Exactly. And if you go further, yes, Patrick Wolf, a very well-known expert on genocide called colonial genocide, structural genocides. Because if they begin with the organization of a humanitarian catastrophe, with the extreme suppression of resistance and so on, then they continue in other forms. This includes disrupting reproduction, abducting children, and so on. And what's very interesting is that in the case of the Nazis, all of this did not develop much further. But we do see it in its embryonic form. Why? Because in 1942, Heinrich Himmler gave exactly the same order that had formed the basis of the government program in Australia at the beginning of the 20th century to remove mixed-race children. Right? He says that, well, obviously, the occupation army ice in 1942, at the beginning of 1942, marriages between Germans and women from the occupied territories were prohibited.
Prohibited.
Absolutely. And the same applied to the ostarbeiters. But it was clear that in Germany itself, even sexual relations between ostarbeiters and German men or women were also prohibited and punishable. It did happen, but it was punishable by law. It was criminalized. In the occupied territories, no one criminalized such relations because, well, obviously there was a huge number, millions of young men there. So it was obvious that such relationships would occur. And Himmler says, well, probably about 1 million children were born here from German men during all this time. This is a very dangerous thing because Aryan blood runs in these children's veins. And if they grow up, thanks to this Aryan blood, the most valuable creative blood, they might be able to resume resistance against us. That's why it's very important to find them, take them away, bring them to Germany and raise them as Germans, because otherwise someone like Stalin might appear. And by 1942, Himmler had already come to the conclusion that Stalin apparently was an Aryan, because only an Aryan could organize such an army out of this mass of so-called inferior subhumans, an army that could resist the Germans. He says this directly, and he started to respect him. Something like that, yes. Yes, by that point, Hitler was already speaking about him with a lot of respect. And accordingly, this program did not see much further development. And we don't know exactly how many children were managed to be taken out from the occupied territories of the Soviet Union. Moreover, these were not only clearly children of Germans, but also children who, according to certain criteria, resembled Aryans blonde-haired, for example. Well, there is a historian, Isabel Heinemann, a German, who is the only one to have studied this issue. She calculated that a total of 50,000 children were taken from the territory of Southeastern Europe. How many of them were specifically from the territory of the USSR is unclear. There was a camp in the town of Konstantinov near Łódź in Poland. At the end of the war, about 400 Soviet children were liberated. They're mostly from Belarus, but also from Ukraine and Russia. But this program began, and this already tells us that this is a clear structure of genocide. The same applies to abortions, right? Forced abortions for Russian women, Soviet women who were ostarbeiters. They found themselves in very different situations, and some of them were taken away together with their husbands. Some of them ended up at agricultural enterprises or simply on farms where life was relatively tolerable. And there, yes, they worked, they were exploited, but still it was possible to have some semblance of a life. And if they were with their husbands, they could, become pregnant. If they were single girls, well, they could interact with other ostarbeiters. So there was some kind of life there.
So it's as if the children weren't from Germans, but rather from their own, among themselves.
If these were children from Slavs, then she was simply forced to have an abortion. Yes. And then this would be found out. That is, the Gestapo had to determine who the father was. Moreover, there was this tricky thing. They would first give her a document and she had to sign it. This is Germany. There, everything had to be done according to the law. Over in the East, no one cared about any of that. But in Germany, they needed a document. And she had to sign her consent for the abortion. If she refused, well, they would threaten her. There was psychological pressure, of course, and in the end, she would sign. Abortions would take place. That's how it was. But if it turned out that the father was German, then there were no abortions. She would give birth, the child would be taken away, she would never see him again, but he would be sent to the appropriate orphanage. Later, a German family was supposed to adopt him, and he was supposed to grow up as a German. This was very important because, as you remember, there were fewer Germans. Every German was extremely valuable because he increased Germany's demographic balance. So this is also a form of genocide.
For me, everything that concerns children is so painful. When I hear these things, I just get chills down my spine.
Yes, a lot of this is very painful. It's very hard to deal with, but it's better, so to speak, to talk about it, right? Because, well, someone has to talk about it. And finally, sterilization. Sterilization, again, was not widely implemented, but this research was being conducted. From 1941, they were searching for a method of mass sterilization all the way until 1945. They conducted experiments, monstrous experiments in Auschwitz, particularly on women, and in Ravensbrück, which was an entirely female camp. Doctors like Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann competed to see who could find the best method of mass sterilization. And it's clear that these tools were not intended to be used against Jews because the Jews had already been sentenced to accelerated extermination, right? I mean, well, that's what Auschwitz was specifically designed for.
What were the options for mass sterilization? I'm not even interested.
Radiation. The very first method they proposed and used was radiation. In other words, everything was organized very simply. People were invited to fill out a form. They would stand at a desk writing something, and during that time, they were secretly being irradiated. They irradiated, let's say, the pelvic organs. And after 2 minutes, once they stepped away from that desk, they were already incapable of ever having children. This method was deemed unsatisfactory because people became ill and lost their ability to work. they needed to come up with a way for people to continue working for the benefit of Greater Germany, but so that no children would be born. At the end of 1941, Dr. Adolf Pokorny sent Himmler. He sent a proposal to Himmler to use the plant caladium, which supposedly could deprive people of their reproductive function. And from this point, this plant grows in South America. It was not considered possible to export it from there in large quantities. That's why an entire saga began, lasting throughout 1942, involving the construction of greenhouses, attempts to grow it in Germany, or to somehow artificially synthesize caladium juice, and experiments were conducted on Roma. In the end, nothing worked out.
And what did they want to do with it? Inject it? Make people drink it?
Mix it into food.
Mix it in?
Mix it into food, yes, that's right. Well, and the last methods, these were carried out by Karl Kloberwere, various acids, or simply operations involving the tying of fallopian tubes. In the end, these methods were actually implemented because, to be honest, you've probably never heard of this, but in my opinion, the second most bureaucratic and organized genocide was carried out in 1996-2000, that is quite recently, in a country called Peru.
I made a documentary film about this, not specifically about this episode, but about the activities of USAID. And this episode actually took place as part of the USAID program, which now...
I actually didn't know that. That's actually astonishing because for those who don't know, in Peru, under the government of Alberto Fujimori, a family reproductive program was adopted, a program for family reproductive care. And so, under the roof of this program, the indigenous women who lived there in the most remote parts of Peru did not speak the state language. They spoke only their native language, Quechua and others. They were simply forcibly sterilized under various pretexts. That is, they were invited to see a doctor, supposedly for a checkup or, say, to have a tumor removed. And that was it, something like 300,000 women over the course of 4 years. It was an absolutely systematic program. And without a doubt, this is genocide. It absolutely fits the definition of the Genocide Convention. The Nazis didn't manage to do this. But the fact that it was done in Peru in 1996 proves that it's real. And if anyone, Hitler certainly wouldn't have been stopped by this at all. In other words, they would have sterilized 1 million people in 10 years, and no one would have felt any pangs of conscience.
In Peru, there was also this aspect that people were completely illiterate, and you could, well, intimidate them, telling them that they would never have children. Or on the contrary, that if you give birth, you'll die. So things like that were also used to scare people. And here in the Soviet Union, we really have to thank the communists and the universal education program, because such methods wouldn't have worked here, but it's clear that it was still done forcibly.
But there's a nuance here, because in fact, I didn't mention cultural genocide at the beginning of our conversation by accident. After all, part of the system. The war of extermination also included the destruction of education for the indigenous people. That is, in some form it would have remained, of course, but it would have been the most basic education, and higher education would perhaps have been available only to a select few who were considered useful. But
later on, not during the Great Patriotic War, right? Exactly.
Yes, naturally. But during the Great Patriotic War, the dismantling of education had already begun, in principle.
Of course.
And it's quite possible that in 5 years, a new generation would have grown up with a completely different level of education. So if the Soviet project was a modernist project that aimed to lift people up, then the Nazis were simply interested in lowering the population's education below the lowest level. And what's very important here, the destruction of cities also had the goal of eliminating the intelligentsia. Well, the intelligentsia in the broad sense, meaning people with an education, they wanted to return the people to ignorance, to superstition, to all those pre-industrial things. And to such a people, and this would have been the first post-war generation like that, because, well, Russia at the beginning of the 20th century was a peasant country, uneducated. That is, this Bolshevik program had only just started working, and it was still possible to roll it back. And the Nazis aimed to roll it back. If they had managed to do that, then in 5 years, it would have been easy to fool anyone in any way.
Yes, and we saw some results of this kind of cultural policy after the 90s.
And now, yes, even now it can be done. Back then, it would have been no problem at all.
Well, and perhaps to sum up, how is it going for you?
Well, who do you mean by us? That's the main question here. Theoretically, from a legal standpoint, within Russia, there are ongoing proceedings, and in every region that was under occupation, corresponding processes are taking place, the result of which is the recognition of the fact of genocide. I have served as an expert in 5 such proceedings, the most important being the blockade of Leningrad, because I am from Leningrad, and I also have very deep emotional experiences connected to this. A very important question of international recognition will arise. On this issue, we are cooperating with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs as much as we can. There has been quite significant progress there, and I think that, well, of course, everything will depend on the political climate, as everything does. We discussed this quite thoroughly. We'll see. But what is the main thing? that the documentary evidence has been collected and the system of arguments has been developed. And it's very difficult to argue against this, the system of arguments, because all the counter-arguments I've heard so far, well, what do they boil down to? To the claim that the destruction of Slavs was not really destruction as such. This is the perspective of a punitive squad commander, and the complete disregard for the genocidal intent that the political leaders of the Third Reich, Hitler, Himmler, Goering, and certainly Herbert Beck here embedded into the practices of the occupation regime. So if the commander of a punitive squad didn't know he was committing genocide, then supposedly it wasn't genocide. That's not how it works. That's not the case. Because a commander, say, some Wehrmacht captain, a Hauptmann, might not have fully understood that by killing Jews, he wasn't just eliminating some Jewish partisans, but was actually destroying the entire Jewish people. That's true. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, he knew that the Holocaust was happening. But even Rudolf Höss and Adolf Eichmann, even in their cases, the court might have had difficulty proving that they had a specific intent to exterminate the Jews. They were simply following orders from higher command. This is quite an important legal question. But that Hitler, Himmler, and others, Bormann, and the rest of the top leadership, all the representatives of the Third Reich's upper echelon had such an intention, there is no doubt about that. And the same applies to the Slavs. Hitler and Himmler had this intention, they voiced this intention, it is documented, and there is no doubt about it. Therefore, people who dispute the genocide need to understand a very important thing, that ultimately the argument is about whether Hitler had this genocidal intent. And in this case, they are acting as Hitler's advocates. Well, let's discuss the issue. I'll accuse Hitler and you'll defend him. Let's see how it goes.
Your opponents don't have a very strong position.
That's true. That's true. Yes, that's true. That's why we will strive to achieve this international recognition. But what's the most important thing here? Even international recognition may not be as important as ensuring that this new information is incorporated into our educational process. Because the most common question from teachers, I speak to teachers a lot, is why is this considered genocide? So why do you, for example, call the blockade of Leningrad a genocide, right? Because again, there are a lot of evasive excuses. For example, an evasive excuse can sound quite convincing if you don't know the details. After all, throughout the history of wars, there have been many sieges, cities were surrounded, and people in those cities died of hunger. Why is the blockade of Leningrad considered genocide? But for example, the blockade of Königsberg in 1945 is not. There was no famine there, but there was a blockade. So why wasn't that considered an attempted genocide? The answer is actually very simple, because most sieges in world history were carried out with the goal of capturing the city, taking it as a fortress. The blockade of Leningrad was not carried out with the aim of capturing the city, but rather with the specific goal of not capturing it, but destroying its population. It was a method of exterminating the population. These are very important nuances that need clarification.
Speaking for myself, Egor, I've read a lot about the war in general and have prepared materials myself. Overall, I thought, well, even now in principle that I knew this period well, but what you told me just shocked me.
And that's very nice to hear.
I'm truly impressed by the depth of your imagination. And I really want to say this. Viewers, comrades, please write in and share your thoughts. What do you think about all this? What is your position? And what else would you like me to ask Egor about? I didn't ask the questions I had prepared, and honestly, I don't even think it makes sense to do so now. Because whenever you talk to someone more knowledgeable than yourself, your questions start to seem kind of silly, not deep enough. So basically, there's really no point in asking them at all.
But if you want, I'm ready.
Igor, I naturally wish you the best of luck with your dissertation defense, with your wonderful festivals, and with all your scientific and creative work. And thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.
Thank you so much. I'll be glad to see you in my studio again. Come to our festival.
Thank you. Come, comrades.